when they look at tithing, they hear from Malachi, you're supposed to give your 10%. But what is tithing in the Old Testament? How did that look like? Because I'm pretty sure it didn't look like how we know it today. So take us down kind of pretty much the history of tithing.
That's great. And I really appreciate you asking that question because uh, that's the historical and the cultural context
Mm,
around the conversation that needs to be had in order to have any kind of arrive at any kind of real biblical understanding of tithing. You've got to deal with it in its original context, historically and culturally. And so, since Israel, the nation, emerged out of a uh, what you would call the ancient Near East.
mm-hmm.
That's the geographical and the cultural context out of which the nation of Israel was called out of,
Right.
and so they were uh, much like the other cultures around them. They weren't very different in the same sense that an American Christian is not culturally different from an American unbeliever. We still share the same culture,
Mm-hmm.
even though we share a different worldview, right? And so Israel, um, just like all of the other nations, one of the things that other nations practiced was essentially called a land tax.
Mm-hmm.
And a land tax is where kings they would charge their those who were subordinate to them, those who were a part of their kingdom. They would charge them essentially a tax. That
Mm-hmm.
land tax is what we would consider the tithe. And so, a little bit about kings and rulers in that day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Suzerains were what you would call a suzerain king was a king that not only controlled different countries, but often countries that had kings themselves. And
Right.
so those kings would also submit to the suzerain king. And so all of those people were considered vassals, that is, servants of the king. And
Mm-hmm.
so the kings that were left in place served, in a sense, as governors, smaller kings that didn't have the same power. And how that would happen is that oftentimes those kings would submit to the suzerain king in order to be left alive, because of course, if he fought back, he was going to be killed, and the land was going to be conquered anyway. And so these kings would oftentimes bring uh, an annual uh, tribute to the, and that's where you get the term King of Kings
Mm-hmm.
and Lord of Lords.
Mm-hmm.
This was the king over other kings, and so the conquered king would bring a tribute every year to the suzerain king,
Mm-hmm.
and the vassals would pay a tenth of the land that they were living on. So everybody was responsible, because what happened is that the king ended up owning everything.
Okay.
So that's another thing is that kings, you didn't own your property. If you were living under the reign of a king, the king owned all the property,
Mm.
and you paid a tax on what was your property, but now it's his. And if
Ain't
you're
that
going to
something?
continue to manage that property and benefit from it, you got to pay that tenth, that tax. So culturally and historically, the tithe was a land tax, and so um, kings would take that, and oftentimes they would use that to fund the temple cult, where various gods were worshipped, and kings oftentimes were often considered patrons of a particular deity. And so it was not uncommon for cultures in the ancient Near East to also have a temple with priests that also made sacrifices and performed rituals in the name of the gods that they worship.
Mm-hmm.
And kings would normally take a portion of that tax and fund the cult so that those priests could function full time at the behest of the king. You see, and so Yahweh essentially took that very same cultural practice and did the
Okay.
very same thing. He deeded Israel land that he owned and told all of the tribes that they could live in that land. And but he did not give the Levites any land of their own. Instead, what he said to the Levites is, I am going to take care of you. So the tenth or the tithe that the other tribes give me for the land that I have given them, I'm going to take that money and I am going to give you the proceeds of the tithe so that all you have to do is focus on sacrificing and serving me in the tabernacle. So Yahweh, as the king of Israel, essentially did what all kings did. He funded the temple with the proceeds from the tithe, which came from the land. So you got to remember, when he promised Abraham that land was distributed to Jacob's children. It wasn't
Okay.
given to Levi, though. And so, because Levi did not get any land, uh, God said, you are my inheritance. And so I'm not going to give you a land inheritance. What I'm going to make sure is that everyone that I gave a land inheritance to will give me a tax that is a 10% for that land. And then I will turn around and make sure that you are taken care of. Because again, you remember that was what you would call an agrarian society. How are people going to take care of themselves without land? And since Levi did not get any land, they had no way of taking care of themselves. And God said, don't worry, I got you. You just take care of my tabernacle. You take care of the sacrifices and the offerings, and I will take care of you. And what Yahweh did is he turned around and he taxed the other tribes for the land that he had deeded them. That's no different than the way that the other I should say the other nations in the ancient Near East and their kings did. So that's really the true history of what tithing is. It's not something particularly spiritual. It is not something that is unique to the Bible or to Israel. It's a cultural practice that you find as very prominent in the various cultures of the ancient Near East.
What's happening? This is Deontay Curl, host of Turn Up the Volume podcast. Listen, do me a favor. If you like this video, do yourself a favor and hit the subscribe button. Also, tap the bell and turn on all of your notifications to see this and more interviews and more shows from my podcast right here on my YouTube page. So, y'all hit that like button, tag, share, and subscribe. Y'all be good.